One of the best ways to support the FTF podcast is to check out our Patreon over at patreon.com/finishthefight for exclusive episodes, insights, interviews, and plenty more. Welcome back to Finish the Fight, a gaming podcast,
where we produce and develop the highest quality gaming research in podcast form.
I am your host, Alex Kendall.
And I am your host, Derek Baker.
And today we're taking it back to a classic, a literal classic, going back to the arcades with what I think is fun. It's got a lot of spin-offs in it. It's truly a Knight's Tale, some might say. We're going to be talking today about Joust.
I love when we talk about the old arcade games because it really was just a different era of gaming. Of course, this stuff all happened a little bit before we were born, but I feel like we still came up in a time where this stuff was widely available to us and we got a good taste of what it was like to get the arcade machine feel, and then get some of the home console version of that stuff as well, where it's a lot of rinse and repeat, muscle memory, and then just straight up having to memorize different levels and patterns to try and beat things. Almost, driving yourself crazy doing so. But just a fun era of gaming and a lot of fun.
Yeah, and that's the thing is so you figure this is coming out in the early 80s. Once we get into more of that home console market in the late 80s into the early 90s, arcade cabinets are still the dominators when it comes to the quality of the game. A lot of the ports that were coming out felt like those original predecessors of the early 80s. So yeah, for us growing up, yes, we were getting some more of those nuanced games, and the console markets were coming into their own. After we're getting into that possible financial collapse in gaming, kind of the downfall of it, of a lot of the arcades closing down, into the home console market actually growing. We do have this wide gap that was kind of widening between the quality. And so let's jump into one of those early adopters of the arcades with Joust. So Joust is an action game developed by Williams Electronics and released in arcades in 1982. While not the first two-player cooperative video game, Joust's success and polished implementation popularized the concept. Player 1 rides an ostrich, player 2, a stork. Repeatedly pressing the flat button gains altitude, while a two-directional joystick controls direction. In a collision with enemy knights riding buzzards, or the other player, the higher rider dismounts the other. John Newcomer led the development team along with Bill Futzenreuter, Janice Voldenberg Miller, Python Angelo, Tim Murphy, and John Koltierek. Newcomer aimed to create a flying game with cooperative two-player gameplay while avoiding the overdone space theme. The game was well received by players and critics, and the mechanics influenced other games. Joust was ported to numerous home systems and was followed by a more complex and less popular arcade sequel in 1986, Joust 2: Survival of the Fittest.
So let's talk a little bit about the studio and its origin. Stanford engineering graduate Harry Williams entered the coin-operated amusement industry in 1933 and helped popularize several important pinball innovations, such as the tilt mechanism, electrically powered scoring holes, and the ability to win a free play by achieving a certain score. After working for a succession of companies including Pacific Amusement Manufacturing, Rock Ola, and Exhibit Supply, he went into business with Lyndon Durant in 1942 under the name United Manufacturing. After a break with Durant, Williams founded the Williams Manufacturing Company in 1943 at 161st West Huron Street in Chicago, Illinois. The first 7 products were a fortune-telling machine called Selector Scope, released in 1944, 2 electromechanical games, or EM games, Periscope, in 1944, and Liberator, a novelty called Zingo, a pinball conversion called Flat Top, released a year later in 1945, another EM arcade game released that year, Circus Romance, and a second pinball conversion called Laura. The 2 pinball conversions, Flat Top and Laura, were built by purchasing older pinball machines made by other companies and changing artwork and other elements on the playfield. The lack of raw materials during World War II made the manufacture of new machines difficult and expensive. The first all-original amusement device made by Williams was a flipperless pinball machine called Suspense in 1946. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, Williams continued to make pinball machines and the occasional bat and ball game. In 1950, Williams produced Lucky Inning, their first pinball machine to have its bottom flippers facing inward in the modern manner. In 1948, Williams sold 49% of his company to a Philadelphia distributor named Sam Stern, who became a vice president and took over much of the day-to-day running of the company. In 1959, Stern orchestrated a buyout of Williams by Consolidated Sun Ray, a New York retail conglomerate that operated drugstores and discount houses. Harry Williams left the company after the buyout of his company, which was renamed the Williams Electronic Manufacturing Corporation. In 1960, Harry Williams designed his last pinball machine for Williams, the horse racing themed Nags. The last game he designed for Williams was also one of the last electromechanical games, Rancho, in 1977.
In 1961, Stern bought Williams back from Consolidated Sun Ray. 3 years later, the company was acquired by the Seaburn Corporation, which also purchased United Manufacturing. The two amusement companies were consolidated under the Williams name, but moved into the United factory. Sam Stern continued to run the amusement business, which was renamed Williams Electronics in 1967. In 1962, 3-Coin became the best-selling Williams machine with 1,100 units sold. 1 year later, Skill Pool sold 2,250 units. In 1964, Williams was purchased by the Seaburn Corporation. Its 1966 pinball machine, A-Go-Go, with its avant-garde 60s theme, sold a record 5,100 units. Early Williams pinball machines often included innovative features and pinball firsts, such as mechanical reel scoring and the atop feature for locations that didn't allow game replays. By 1967, pinball was in the middle of its so-called golden age, and the number of pinball units that sold began to increase dramatically. Popular Williams pinballs included Shangri-La in '67, Apollo, Beat Time, Smart Set in 1969, Gold Rush in '71, and Space Mission in '76.
Taking note of Atari's success with Pong in 1972, Williams decided to enter the fledgling coin-operated arcade video game industry. After preliminary negotiations with Magnavox, it subcontracted the Magnetic Corporation of America to create its first arcade video game, Paddleball. In 1974, Williams Electronics Incorporated was formed to acquire the company. In 1980, Seaburg sold Williams to Louis Nicastro, who, with his son Neil, would take the company public and run it for over 2 decades. Williams developed its own breakthrough hit with the release of 1981's Defender, whose gameplay, horizontal scrolling, and dynamic color influenced many subsequent games. It was followed by a sequel in the same year, Stargate, and a group of popular and influential titles, Joust, Robotron 2084, Sinistar, and the licensed Moon Patrol. With the exception of Sinistar, these were widely ported to home systems by external developers and publishers, including Atari Incorporated.
Now, following the success of the 1981 game Defender, Williams searched for new creative staff. John Newcomer, believing video games to be the future of entertainment, left his job as a toy designer to work at Williams, who hired him to create game ideas as support for development staff. After a few days, he generated a list of ideas that included ideas for his top 2 games, The War of the Worlds and Joust. Technical specifications dictated the selection because his vision of The War of the Worlds was technologically infeasible, whereas Joust could be accomplished with hardware already available at Williams. A development team was formed, which decided to create the game using Defender's hardware. Newcomer was also inspired by the 1980s movie Flash Gordon. Newcomer conceived Joust as a flying game with cooperative two-player gameplay. However, he did not wish to emulate the popular space theme of previous successful flying games like Asteroids and Defender. To that end, he made a list of things that could fly: machines, animals, and fictional characters. After evaluating the positive and negative of each idea, Newcomer chose birds for their wide appeal and his familiarity with fantasy and science fiction media featuring birds. To further increase his understanding, Newcomer went to the library to study mythology. He believed that the primary protagonist should ride a majestic bird. The first choice was an eagle, but the lack of graceful land mobility dissuaded him. Instead, he decided that a flying ostrich was more believable than a running eagle. To differentiate between the first and second player characters, the developers picked a stork, believing the proportions were similar to an ostrich, while the color difference would avoid confusion among players. Newcomer chose vultures as the main enemies, believing that they would be recognizably evil. Angelo created concept art of the characters as guidance for further design.
The decision to use birds prompted Newcomer to deviate from the standard 8-direction joystick. He implemented a flapping mechanism to allow players to control the character's ascent and descent. With the vertical direction controlled via the arcade cabinet's button, a two-way joystick was added to dictate horizontal direction. Though other Williams employees were concerned about the design, Newcomer believed that a direct control scheme for flight would strengthen the connection between the player and the character. The combat was devised to allow for higher levels of strategy than traditional shooting games. Because flying became an integral gameplay element, he chose to have characters collide as a means of combat, with victory decided by on-screen elevation. The developers created the game using 96K of ROM chip storage, which limited the data size of individual graphics and sound effects they could use. The ROM size limits also prohibited Newcomer from creating more characters. The graphics are hand-animated pixel art. To animate the birds, Woldenberg Miller used Edward Muybridge's book Animals in Motion as a reference. Given the limited memory, she had to balance the number of frames to minimize file size while maintaining realistic animation. Woldenberg Miller chose gray for the buzzards, but changed it to green to optimize the color palette, as the developers had only 16 colors to create the entire display. Once the colors were decided for the character sprites, Newcomer finalized the look of the platforms. The hardware had limited audio capabilities, and sounds typically require larger amounts of memory than graphics. Working with these restrictions, Newcomer instructed Murphy and Kotlaric to focus on select sounds he deemed important to reinforcing gameplay. He reasoned that the audio would serve as conspicuous hints that players could use to adjust their strategy. Newcomer prioritized the crucial wing flap sound above others related to the pterodactyl, collisions, and hatching eggs.
In designing the levels, Newcomer added platforms to the environment after the combat was devised. A static game world was chosen instead of a scrolling world to focus on detailed visual textures applied to the platforms. The hardware could not easily display the textures while scrolling, and the team believed that displaying the whole environment would aid players. The final game world element designed was a lava pit, and a hand reaching out of it to destroy characters too close to the bottom of the screen. Newcomer placed the platforms to optimize Futzenrutter's enemy artificial intelligence, which was programmed for attack patterns based partly on platform placements. The night enemies were designed to exhibit progressively more aggressive behavior. Bounders flew around the environment randomly, occasionally reacting to the protagonist. Hunters sought the player's character in an effort to collide. Shadow Lords flew quickly and closer to the top of the screen. Futzenrutter designed them to fly higher when close to the protagonist to increase the Shadow Lord's chances of victory against the player. The pterodactyl was designed to prevent players from idling and to be difficult to defeat, as it was vulnerable only when its mouth was open during a specific animation frame, and it quickly flies upward at the last moment when approaching a player waiting at the edge of a platform. The game prioritizes its graphics processing to favor the player characters over the enemies, so enemies begin to react more slowly when the number of on screen sprites increases. While playtesting the game, the team discovered an animation bug they described as a belly flop. The flaw allowed players to force the ostrich or stork sprite through an otherwise impassable small gap between two adjacent platforms of very close elevation. Because it provided an interesting method to perform a sneak attack on an opponent below the gap, and because of limited time available, the developers decided to keep the defect rather than fix it. A second bug, which allows the pterodactyl to be easily defeated, was discovered after the game was first distributed. Newcomer had always designed the game and its AI with each sprite's dimension in mind, but the pterodactyl sprite had been altered to improve the appearance one day before the game was finished. The new sprite allowed the pterodactyl to be easily defeated an unending number of times. The player could sit on the center ledge with a single enemy knight caught indefinitely in the hand of the lava troll and kill an unlimited number of pterodactyls simply by turning to face them as they entered the screen. Using this flaw, the player could quickly accumulate a very high score and a large cache of lives with no significant skill required. Upon learning of the flaw, Williams shipped a new ROM for the arcade cabinets to deal with the distributor's complaints.
So we've touched on it a little bit, but let's talk more about the gameplay. The player controls a yellow knight riding a flying ostrich. The player navigates the protagonist around the game world, which consists of rock platforms floating above a flat island surrounded by lava via two-way joystick and a button. The joystick controls the horizontal direction that the knight travels, while the button flaps the ostrich's wings. The rate at which the player repeatedly flaps causes the ostrich to fly upward, hover, or slowly descend. Moving off the left or right edges of the screen wraps around to the other side. The objective is to defeat the groups of enemy knights riding buzzards in each wave. Upon completing a wave, a more challenging one begins. Players pilot the knight to collide with enemies. The higher of two jousting lances is the winner. A collision of equal height repels the characters apart. A defeated enemy turns into a falling egg which can be collected for points. If the player does not collect the egg, it hatches into a knight that gains a new mount and must be defeated again unless the egg falls into the lava, in which case it is destroyed. There are 3 types of enemy knight: Bounder, Hunter, and Shadow Lord, which are separate colors and worth different amounts of points. A pterodactyl appears after a predetermined time frame to hunt the hero. The disembodied hand of an indestructible lava troll grabs any character flying too low and pulls them into the lava. In a 2-player game, the second player controls a blue knight on a stork. The 2 players cooperatively complete the waves, optionally attacking each other.
Now, as we said at the top of the episode, there were a number of different release versions. Atari Inc. published Joust for its own systems and under the Atari Soft label for others: the Atari 2600, Atari 5200, Atari 7800, the Atari 8-bit family, Apple II, Macintosh, and IBM PC. Joust was ported to the Nintendo Entertainment System, programmed by Satoru Iwata. A port of Joust to the BBC Micro was done by Stuart Cheshire under the pseudonym Delos de Harriman, which he also used for his networked tank game Bolo. But since Atari Soft had reportedly ceased releasing titles for other systems, the work remained largely unavailable and was subsequently acquired by Aardvark Software, publisher of Frack and Zalaga, whereupon it received its first review. The game, nevertheless, remained unavailable for over a year before eventually being released as Skirmish by Godox for the BBC Micro and Acorn Electron.
And of course, being a popular game, it has a little bit of an expanded following or a legacy. A Joust-themed pinball table was released in 1983, designed by Barry Orsler and Constantino Mitchell. The game includes artwork and themes from the arcade version. In addition to single-player gameplay, it features competitive 2-player gameplay with the players on opposing sides of the machine. Fewer than 500 machines were produced. An arcade sequel, Joust 2: Survival of the Fittest, was released in 1986. It features similar gameplay with new elements on a vertical screen. In 2004, Midway Games also launched a website featuring the browser based Shockwave versions. The game is in several multi platform compilations: the 1996 Williams Arcade's Greatest Hits, the 2000 Midway's Greatest Arcade Hits, and the 2003 Midway Arcade Treasures. Other compilations are the 1995 Arcade Classic 4 for the Game Boy and the 2005 Midway Arcade Treasures Extended Play for the PlayStation Portable. Joust was released via digital distribution on GameTap, Xbox Live Arcade, and the PlayStation Network. In 2012, Joust was included in the compilation Midway Arcade Origins. Other remakes were in development but never released. Previously unreleased Atari Soft prototypes of Joust for the ColecoVision surfaced in 2001 at the Classic Gaming Expo in Las Vegas. An adaptation with three-dimensional graphics and a port of the original Joust as a bonus was in development for the Atari Jaguar. Titled Dactyl Joust, it was eventually canceled. Another remake that was in development was Joust 3D for the Nintendo 64. Because the arenas were in 3D, it was to use a split screen for the multiplayer battles. Newcomer pitched an updated version of the arcade game for the Game Boy Advance to Midway Games, which declined. The prototype uses multi-directional scrolling, more detailed graphics based on 3D renders, and new gameplay mechanics. Tiger Electronics released a keychain version of Joust in 1998. A mobile phone version was released in 2005, but omitted the flapping control scheme. It is also an included title on the Midway Legacy Edition Arcade 1-Up cabinet.
Now we also see Joust in some pop culture. Midway Games optioned Joust's movie rights to CP Productions in 2007. Michael Sorenzi of CP Productions described the script by Mark Gottlieb as Gladiator meets Mad Max, set 25 years in the future. The June 2008 release date was pushed back to 2009, then Midway filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2009. Warner Brothers Interactive Entertainment purchased most of Midway's assets, including Joust, with the intent, so we might still get it, to develop movie adaptations. Joust is referenced in the Robot Chicken episode Celebitard Mountain, the Code Monkeys episode Just One of the Gamers, and the video games Mortal Kombat 3, Shang Tsung turns into the character from Joust as his friendship, and World of Warcraft Cataclysm. In the book Ready Player One, Wade Watts defeats an NPC in two-player Joust.
Given the peculiar control scheme, Williams was concerned that the game would be unsuccessful, and arcades were hesitant to purchase the game. However, Williams eventually shipped 26,000 units, and Electronic Games in 1983 described it as tremendously popular. In the United States, it topped the Play Meter arcade charts in January 1983, and the Replay Upright arcade cabinet charts from January to February 1983. It was among the 13 highest grossing arcade games of 1983 in the United States. A cocktail table version was later released, engineered by Leo Ludzia. It is unique among cocktail games with its side-by-side seating rather than opposing sides, allowing Williams to reuse the same ROM chip from the upright cabinets. With substantially fewer units manufactured than the upright arcade machine, the cocktail version is a rare collector's item. French magazine Tilt rated the arcade game 4 out of 6 stars in 1983. Computer and Video Games rated the Atari VCS version 83% in 1989. In 1996, Next Generation listed the arcade version as number 83 on its top 100 games of all time, calling it a perfect example of the three ingredients that all too often make a classic: original concepts, quirky designs, and above all, playability. With only 3 controls, left, right, and flap, Joust creates an entire world of elegant combat. Video game historian Steve Kent considered Joust one of the more memorable games of its time. Author David Ellis agreed and stated that the game remains enjoyable to this day. In 2008, Guinness World Records listed it as the number 69 arcade game in technical, creative, and cultural impact. A writer for Video Gaming Illustrated called Joust exotic with lifelike animation. Antic called the Atari 8-bit version a unique, addictive arcade game that was almost identical to the original. The magazine concluded that Joust was Atari's finest since Star Raiders.
Kevin Bowen of GameSpy's Classic Gaming wrote that Joust has an incredibly stupid concept, but is an appealing game with good controls and competitive gameplay. He said it is, quote, one of the first really fun multiplayer games, differentiated from other contemporary multiplayer games, and a precursor to the video game deathmatch. Retro gamer writer Mike Bevan called the game's physics beautifully realized and described Joust as one of the most remarkable and well-loved titles of the Williams library. A computer and video games writer called the game weird and wonderful. Author John Sellers praised the competitive two-player gameplay and attributed the game's appeal to the flapping mechanism. In 2004, Ellis described Joust as an example of innovative risk absent in the then current video game industry. In retrospect, Newcomer commended Williams' management for taking a risk on him and the game. The game has garnered praise from industry professionals as well. Jeff Peters of Gearworks Games lauded the gameplay, describing it as unique and intuitive. Jeff Johannigman of Fusion Learning Systems praised the flapping mechanism, and Kim Pallister of Microsoft enjoyed the multiplayer aspect. Several games by other developers either copy or build upon Joust's design. The 1983 Jetpack and Mario Bros. And the 1984 Balloon Fight have elements inspired by it. The flying mechanics in the 2000 game Messiah were inspired by Joust, and the arcade game Killer Queen was heavily inspired by Joust and mixes elements of it with RTS and MOBA games. So, as we come to a close with Joust, I want to say that, it has been such a huge inspiration. We were talking about it earlier, and I'd gotten mixed up with Balloon Fight, which was available as a NES ROM in the GameCube Animal Crossing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very similar in that flying mechanic of trying to get above your opponents, and in that you're kind of popping balloons that your opponents have. But very much the same way as Joust, of trying to get above them to knock them out, grab an egg or grab an element of it to score those points.
Yeah.
And it is that wild west of gaming, of coming out of, hey, pinball and these coin-operated mechanical games have been the domineering entertainment aspect since the 30s, since the 20s that we're seeing with this stuff that's slowly evolved, getting that golden era in the 60s. And in the 70s, trying to look forward, like, what's the next thing? What's the next thing that coin operation or that arcades or that entertainment's going to be? And we start to see that in these arcade cabinets that came about.
Yeah, the old school arcades, they were pretty much dying by the time that we were reaching, I think, our teenage years, probably in the early 2000s. That's when we really stopped seeing a lot of that stuff, I think. And even by that point, it wasn't so much the coin-operated stuff like this. It was more like, racing sims and, little like games to win tickets and just little mini games and things like that. So there is a bit of mysticism, I feel like, that comes from the whole 80s arcade aesthetic that I know that bars now are like popping up trying to recreate that same aesthetic. And it's just such a unique period, I think, for gaming, where you did have to go out, you did have to go to a place, you did have to have money to put into these machines, and then leave the arcade and go home. Like now you can just go to your bedroom or wherever your gaming console is, your computer, and you could just play video games there. So just a totally different time and a totally different way to think about gaming in general, because there's also that aspect of this game has to make money, right? So what kind of things do they have to do to sell and then get people putting more quarters into the machine factors in as well, where maybe the modern equivalent of that is like season passes, things like that, where it's an extended life cycle. So just a really cool era in gaming for sure. Now, talking about how this game was an inspiration for other games, think about the Mario levels where he's underwater. What do? You flap, basically essentially the same thing, and you swim upwards, or you stop flapping and you float downwards in the water. I mean, 100% exactly like the Joust gameplay. I think Joust as an influence is really interesting because I do feel that it is 100% gameplay influencing other games that then have better story and color and things like that, where this game's origin is so like silly and preposterous that the gameplay is really what saves it. And I think that it's interesting to try and carry that legacy on then in film and TV adaptations to really even be attempting to do that, because I feel like this game is really so far out of its depth in terms of like lore and story versus even other video games from that era that maybe they misunderstand the importance of Joust and what people really loved about it, which I believe was the addictive gameplay.
It definitely was. And going back to those early 80s, we're starting to get into more of that home console market. And coming off, the mid to late 60s of a very golden age of, we'll call it arcade gaming, coin operated gaming, just gaming in general, we get the video game crash of 1983. Now, for those of you who don't know, this is where, because you've probably heard of the Jaguar, you've heard of Atari, you've heard of Intellivision, you've heard of all these different consoles that have started to come about. And basically what it was kind of this very large rush of electronics developers to be like, we want to be the home console. We want to bring those arcade cabinets and the idea that we have with Williams and stuff to your home. Well, this started to happen as there were huge saturations in the market, poor qualities, and we had in 1983 home console revenue or home gaming revenue peaked around 3.2 billion. In 1985, it's 100 million. So we see this huge drop where like it's our game's going to survive. Our video game's going to survive. You and I can look back very fondly of these games, these arcade cabinets as we play them on Arcade 1-Up. And we could play them again in that same feel. And it wasn't really until Nintendo put out the NES to try and combat this and be like, hey, whoa, there's a lot of pitfalls we got to get over, which is also another fantastic game. That they really set this precedent. So it is really cool to look back on these eras of like, and again, going back to this, where we start in the 30s with Williams and like this idea of like creating coin operated games and how far that came. I mean, listen, we're all addicted to the shine. We're all addicted to putting that coin into a slot, buzzers and bings and flippers going all over the place. We just had to make it all fancy, baby.
Right. No, it's one of my favorite episodes that we've talked about in a long time because I think that the gaming entertainment sphere, you forget about a lot of those mechanical pinball machines and things, and really where like playing these quick games really came from and how they evolved, where, it was about like putting quarters in the machine and whoever owned it making a little bit of cash and trying to make that addictive gameplay. And just seeing what that has evolved into now. I mean, these massive stories, these huge worlds and characters, and you could really get lost in so many worlds. And to think about even back then, people having the forethought of, well, I'm going to make Joust, but I need to do some research. I need to learn about birds. I need to sort of see what birds would fit this game the best. I need to understand the way they move. And to think about that in a game that's highly pixelated and doesn't really have the graphical range to really even be able to fully recreate that type of movement from a bird, but to have I think the desire to get as close as possible, even despite those limitations, shows that people were always forward thinking when it came to the gaming industry. That, they knew that going back to the mechanical pinball days, that there was going to need to be new innovations. And how could we keep innovating and innovating until we sort of run ourselves dry? And then, of course, you do see those little bubbles burst like in 83. And I think that right now you see a little bit of fatigue within the long life cycles, but that could just be me as an old man gamer without the time to play in
Well,
those 10-year cycles.
and going back to that as well, it's, coming off Defender and these other ones that were either four directional on like a single plane they could travel across, even like asteroids had stuff like that. To go back to being like, hey, it's a left and right, it's a static screen, but then it's like, let's figure out the math on ascending and descending in a way that is the same way that we're using gravity. It's such a smooth feel, like you can get your tapping down and when your descent's going. And then to get the math of like, okay, the descent's happening. I'm going to start tapping ascend. Where does that start to travel back up to ascension? It's not just an immediate thing. And you're right, bringing up Mario and very many of those like water levels that we see in gaming. And then even to like something as simple as Flappy Bird that takes that same idea of mechanic of like tapping to ascend, releasing to descend, is taking those very simple principles that we see today, but being like, hey, how do we figure out that math to allow it to accelerate and decelerate through these options and then build that speed, going across screens, taking out these enemies. It's such a cool way of thinking about it and being like, hey, here's my two ideas: War of the Worlds or two dudes on birds stomping on other birds. Which one can we do?
Yeah. The whole concept is so absurd to me. You've got a yellow knight on an ostrich jousting other knights on vultures and pterodactyls, and they become eggs. And I mean, it's just perfect, like cocaine addled 80s content that just didn't need to happen the way it happened. The gameplay is super addicting though. And so you give it all a pass because you're high flying, jousting these other knights at the arcades on a Friday night. So it
Oh,
doesn't
yeah.
matter the reasons. It doesn't matter because that's what's happening. And that's what's so
Exactly.
great about that era of gaming. I think it's so pure. It is so specific to the gameplay because you really had to use your imagination, and that sort of goes into the home consoles as well, where it's just, you get the little booklet that tells you the backstory, and then you got to sort of use your imagination. But yeah, jousting on ostriches and then storks is, I don't know. It could have been a lot of things.
It's a great pastime with it. So, as we come to the end of this, Derek, as always, we've said a lot about it, but let the people know, why did we choose it and what do you give it?
I mean, the influence is undeniable. It really is. And that's a really cool thing. I think we don't give these older games enough credit. You can go and play a lot of stuff like this through virtual consoles. Of course, there's ROMs available. You could probably get a lot of this stuff on your phone and just play it in passing. And I think that stuff, it's always going to be around. It's always going to be an option. And I think that is really fun and interesting. To me, the game itself, it's like, do I say it's great today? Do I say it's great for then? Like, I think it's probably a 10 out of 10 arcade game. I've played some really frustrating arcade games that just don't get the movement right. You die for the wrong reasons. I don't think that this is one of those games. So I'm going to give it a 10 on arcade game scale. What about you?
Yeah, I think you're right. The influence of it. And I really love the Wild West era of gaming, of just being like, hey, electronics company, I got an idea. I don't know how to do it. I was a toy maker who just has some neat ideas. What if you can find me a couple people who can build me this? And I love that idea of gaming. It's very reminiscent of the late 90s, early 2000s Halo era and all these games of like these like studios starting to pop up into more of these like higher end 3D realms of like just a scrappy group of people coming together for a passion project. It kind of loses some of that corporatiness that you kind of started with that we've kind of really heightened to now. But it's such a cool era. And honestly, like I'd love to explore more of the crash of the 80s, of 83 specifically, and just to see like how the reason we don't have so many consoles, the reason we're not, vying at this point with 20 companies, and we're really with 3. And it's almost, we're getting to 2 almost.
Yeah.
Is one of those things that's such an interesting history to gaming, and to see where we are today, that what was almost the downfall, and really was the downfall of a lot of systems back then, was exclusivity. You only had these licensing rights to those consoles they were on. We saw that again with like the, are you a Microsoft or a PlayStation fanboy, has now expanded past that and has really fought against another crash in terms of like a home console market, allowing PC to play it, allowing that crossplay between Nintendo and Xbox and PlayStation. It's really cool to see where we came from to where we are now. So if I had to give it a rating, it would be stay in school and history is cool, kids, out of 10.
Nice. I like it. History is cool. For sure. And man, mechanical pinball machines. Forgot about how good some of that stuff feels sometimes. That's what I love about like modern gaming, bringing the haptics into like new controllers. And there's like a feel to that stuff that just feels great, and I miss that responsiveness of pinball machines and arcades and things like that. If I see a pinball machine when I'm out and about, like, I'm hitting that thing up. It doesn't matter.
You got to.
What I'm doing. Like, dude, I need to play that pinball machine.
You have to.
That Hugh Hefner, like 1980s relic that looks like it's been there since literally the day it was made 50 years ago.
Still got to jump in, throw some quarters in.
Yeah, exactly. Research for this episode was done by Alex Kendall and Derek Baker. The intro and outro music was given to us by our friend Evan Barr, and our lovely artwork was provided by Aaron Shattuck.
Beautiful people, as well as the beautiful people over on our Patreon. You can check us out at patreon.com/finishthefight. We've got plenty of physical and digital rewards there. Want to thank a few select members today with Snide T-Bird, Nick Hyman, and Anthony Gooch. Thank you so much for your support.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or most likely your favorite podcast listening platform. If you haven't yet, please drop us a review. It helps us out a lot, and we love to hear from you.
You can check us out on Twitch. You can see me at twitch.tv/sourman70. That is twitch.tv/sourman70, as well as Derek over at twitch.tv/thebakerman247. That is twitch.tv/thebakerman247.
You can follow this podcast on Instagram or Twitter. We're also in Discord. We have a Discord channel. It is free to join. There is a link in the description of every episode, and we would love to see you there.
And with that, this has been our coverage of Joust. Are there any other super retro games that you want us to cover? Anything that you think influenced modern gaming as a whole? Let us know on our socials or our Discord, and we will cover it in a future episode. And with that, as always, I am your host, Alex Kendall.
And I am your host, Derek the Jouster.
And this has been Finish the Fight, a gaming podcast.